Written by Mark Wahlbeck. Narrated by Mark Wahlbeck.
Lucas tightened the bolts that surrounded the platform the welding unit rested on. This was his final maintenance check of the day, and the last task he would ever perform upon the Feilong. His particular role this month in the Cadet League was to sanitize the shuttle bay of the craft. Usually, he performed this task alone, but today, all cadets were ordered to perform their jobs simultaneously. "Are we finished, cadet?" demanded the commander in his thick Mandarin accent. Lucas secured the sanitation kit to the wall and then pulled himself through the entryway and out into the hall. "Yes, Commander Leong." 12 other cadets lined against the rear wall, holding on to the ceiling's guide rail to keep them in place. Lucas took his spot in the rear of the group, hovering next to the commander, who was holding a digital tablet. Nervously, Lucas turned his head toward the girl standing just to the right of the commander. Though the standard issue space scrubs were normally loose and without form, Jingyi had somehow managed to accentuate her feminine figure through the outfit. Lucas wondered how someone so beautiful and soft-spoken could come from the likes of Commander Leong, who was the exact opposite, both rigid and tough. Jingyi's hair was jet black and pulled back into a tight bun. Though he had never seen it so, Lucas was sure her hair would flow down to her lower back if let down, and with any reasonable amount of gravity. Her fair skin beamed in striking contrast to her royal blue officer scrubs. Suddenly, her eyes flickered up and met his gaze. Lucas's heart fluttered, but he maintained his own gaze with confidence. This forbidden dance of the eyes was a well-rehearsed routine. His heart seemed to convulse in pain as if impelled by a dagger. All he wanted to do at this moment was glide over to this young woman he had loved so passionately over the last 2 years and wrap her in his arms ferociously and never relinquish his grip. But such a brash act would be impossible. That rigid voice that he despised so much suddenly pierced the air, and the moment was quickly stolen from him as Commander Leong took control of the silence. "As you are all aware," he said in his normal taut stance, hands behind his back, "today is our last day aboard the Feilong. You have served both of your countries very well." Lucas felt his heart sinking as the words he knew one day would come were being spoken. All great things come to an end, he had whispered days ago to Jingyi within the confines of the soon-to-be deployed ground rover. She had taken his hand in hers and kissed it. "But love is eternal," she had replied with a smile. Jingyi then reached into the pocket of her scrubs and produced an indelible marker. She pulled Lucas toward her, and the zero-G moved him with ease. With her warm breath against his neck, she began to draw a series of lines onto his bare right arm. "What does it mean?" he had asked her. She capped the marker and looked longingly into his eyes. "Eternity," she whispered. With his heart on fire and a tear in his eye, Lucas pulled Jingyi into him, chest to chest, and kissed her deeply. Sudden pain on the left side of his head brought him back into reality. The commander retracted the hand that had just struck him and was now hovering directly in front of Lucas, nose to nose. "Though some of you are young and immature," he said, gazing into his eyes with fury, "you will go on to do great things." Commander Leong pushed away from Lucas and looked at the whole body of cadets and then nodded his head in approval. "You are now dismissed from under my command. You will immediately report to fertility for your final examination, and then will have leisure until 1900 hours. Lucas and the rest of the cadets gave a firm salute to the commander, which he returned briskly, and then the cadets scattered down the hall. As they moved, Lucas held back, waiting for the commander and his daughter to pass. The man moved past him without a glance. Jingyi slowly pulled her way parallel to Lucas and then lingered herself for a moment. Their eyes locked again. Her beauty was stunning and somehow made him want to scream. But it wasn't just her beauty that tortured him so. It was her, everything about her. She was an officer and held rankings and education levels that he would likely never obtain in his entire life. She was arranged to pair with another officer of the People's Republic of China, while he was designated to Susan Leavenworth, a third-rank American like himself. They were 2 worlds apart, and yet she had chosen him. Not only chosen him, but had loved him. His inner turmoil turned into rage, and for just a moment he thought he might pull her away right now by the hand, take her and hide in the ground rover, and then flee together when they reached Nuwa. But as soon as it had come, the thought vanished into obscurity and was replaced with terrible sadness. As he stared into her dark eyes, they touched hands for just a moment. He knew they couldn't linger, and that even this small encounter was dangerous. She squeezed his hand with greater affection than he had ever before felt, or perhaps it was simply a final affection. And then he realized that this was it. There would be no final embrace. There would be no departing kiss or expression of love. So Lucas did the only thing that he could. He squeezed her hand in return. He made a point to memorize the softness of her skin and the shape of her nimble bones. He wanted this final chance encounter with the woman whom he had loved for 2 years to be one to remember. And after what seemed like an eternity and what felt like only a microsecond, Jingyi released her grip and then floated down the hallway. In the distance, Lucas eyed the airlock that separated the maintenance bay from the arboretum. He thought he might seal that door and then jettison the rear bay and allow himself to drift off into the endless void of space, a place where he could hold on to eternity. But that was not Jingyi. She was not a fictitious memory that could be frozen in time. She needed to live for him, and he needed to live for her. Lucas spent the next hours in a mindless daze as the ship made its final preparations for tomorrow's departure. He would soon gather with Susan, and both she and he would receive their fertility tests. He would listen to her speak of the new world and of all the possibilities that awaited them. He would look into her blue eyes, and they would be kind and pleasant, but they would lack something which he couldn't quite explain. Perhaps he might come to love Susan, perhaps even in the same way he had longed for Jingyi. But he did not believe that. Not really. Sleep did not come to Lucas, and it was not desired, for he knew his dreams would taunt him of something he could not have. Soon, hundreds of lander pods would fling toward the green planet. The red pods would land in Sector 7, and the blue pods would move over 6,000 miles to the west and across the Great Ocean in Sector 12. As the crew of the Feilong strapped him and Susan into their pod, she squeezed his hand reassuringly. Lucas appreciated the sentiment, but such a gesture was vastly different from what he had received just the day before. Some time went by, and his eyes glossed over as he tried to push down the lump in his throat. Lucas barely felt the rumble of the pod as it jettisoned into space and toward Nuwa. After a moment, he slowly turned his head to look through the large window that encased the pod. In the distance, he could see scores of red pods scattering in the stretching space. Then something caught his eye. Just meters away was a lingering red pod that seemed to keep pace with his own. Suddenly, his heart took comfort, and his melancholy began to dissipate. On the side of the pod, in dark ink, a large symbol had been painted. He stared at it for a few moments longer, and then the pod pulled away with the others in its group. A tear floated from his cheek, and he turned his head forward with a smile. "What is it? Is something wrong?" asked Susan. "No. Everything is right." Lucas stared into the beautiful green planet that awaited them below, and then squeezed Susan's hand with affection. "Eternity," he whispered. Author's notes. So someone commissioned me to write a love story. I've never written a love story before, and they gave me a reference. What was it? It was like called The Maladies something. Anyway, so I started reading these love stories, and I don't read love stories, and it was really hard. It was hard to picture two people falling in love in New York or in Mumbai or something. It's just not how my personality works. And so the first thing that came to my mind is I want to do this in space. And let's see if I can build a love story without focusing on space. And that's what I tried to do. And I was really happy with it. And so was the person that asked me to write this for them. And it helped me out a lot too in my writing, because it's important to convey affection and characters, even in environments like sci-fi or whatever it might be. And so that's how it turned out to be. So I hope you enjoyed it.